I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say what a privilege it is to listen to Candy speak, for at least three reasons. Firstly, Candy is, apart from members of the National Union of Mine Workers, probably the living person who's been on strike more than anyone else in Britain. This is not her first strike, I have to say. And actually we should learn from people like that. I've never been on strike for 111 days. Most of you, none of you in fact, have been on strike for 111 days. And we should listen to people from the sharp edge of the resistance, in my view. Any TUC leader, any unit general secretary could learn from what Candy's experience has been. The second thing is, we need victories. So often we spend our time analysing failure. Often we forget to trumpet it when our side wins. All the press did a great job of promulgating the defeat at Grangemouth in Scotland, for example, when those workers were humiliated by their boss and forced to accept appalling conditions. They will not do anything like the same of a victory of the National Gallery workers. It's our job to tell people about victories and tell them, if you fight, you can win. Very, very important to give people confidence. So let's use the experience of those gallery workers to encourage others to be inspired by that prospect. And thirdly, if 150 National Gallery workers can fight and defeat their employer, what could we do as a movement if the big unions and 6.5 million trade unionists had the same sense of determination and defiance as those workers? And that's the argument we have to put forward. If those millions were organised in a battle against the Tories and against austerity, we could win greater victories than those that are possible by local struggles alone. And therefore we should learn from it a new determination to make this success a launch pad for further struggle. And what's happened in Manchester this week should also be a launch pad for further struggle. What have we learned this week? Firstly, we've learned that the Tories are as brutal as ever. Actually, that's wrong. We've learned the Tories are going to be more brutal than ever. Let's delve into the depths of some of their speeches. Theresa May, for example, she was the woman who, you remember, will say that the Tories had a difficulty because they were conceived of as being the nasty party. Clearly her mission this week was to make people think they were the even nastier party. Theresa May, who said that the scale of immigration in Britain was making it impossible to have a cohesive society. Let's be clear, there was no problem with having a cohesive society amongst the 100,000 people who demonstrated on Sunday. There's no problem in most communities and in most workplaces between people, whether they were born here or not born here, whether they're black, Asian or white, whether they are migrants, asylum seekers, refugees, or have lived here for a long time. That's not the major source of where racism comes from. It comes from the deliberate attempts at division by the people at the top of the society. And Theresa May's speech was a deliberate attempt to whip up racism, to whip up hatred, and to whip up scapegoating. And therefore it is of the greatest importance that whatever else we learn from this past week, of the need for unity and cohesion against precisely those attempts to divide us, in support of refugees, in support of the delegations to Calais on the 17th of October, and for a clear message to go out that refugees are welcome here, that migrants are welcome here, and we are going to refuse to be divided by the likes of Theresa May. The second level of speeches came from Jeremy Hunt. Jeremy Hunt, who said that the importance of getting rid of tax credits was that we needed a cultural change in Britain. A cultural change because an earned pound is worth a lot more than a pound that you get on benefits. a disgusting attack actually upon people who are on benefits, and an attempt to say that the welfare state must be turned into a humiliation state. That anyone who is forced to claim benefits is to be regarded as second-rate, second-class, and to be regarded as a parasite upon the rest of us. Of course, he didn't claim that this earned pounds compared to benefit pound applied to people who inherit wealth. Hunt himself, the recipient of a £4 million inheritance, and the Tory cabinet, stuffed with people whose wealth came not from what they'd earned, but from the money that they'd inherited. And Hunt went on to say that what people had to learn was to work as hard as the Americans or the Chinese. In other words, their vision is that they've gone not nearly far enough in destroying the living standards of working class people, but they have to continue to force them down further and further until on a global level they are equal to some of the poorest and most hard-working and most long-working per week workers across the world. That's their vision. Much, much further still has to go. And topped off by David Cameron. Cameron, who had three legs of what he talked about, first of all, an attack upon Muslims, to say that there was a fundamental problem in Britain with extremism, and although he tried to prettify it, it was obvious what he was talking about when he said that the sources of radicalisation came from the madrasas of Mogadishu to the bedrooms of Birmingham. Clearly some spin doctor had told him about the uses of alliteration. Madrasas of Mogadishu, bedrooms of Birmingham. Well, we can do that as well. The sources of radicalisation and why people hate American and British imperialism are the imperialism of Iraq, the persecution of the Palestinians, and the murder of Muslims. That's the truth about where it comes from. And he also said that Jeremy Corbyn was a terrorist sympathiser. A terrorist sympathiser because he has been, to his great credit, an opponent of the imperialist wars of Britain and the United States for a long period, and Jeremy has a fantastic record of opposing those wars. We should be careful about David Cameron and terrorists, because of course we remember that in his youth Cameron was saying that the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela were terrorists, with whom we sympathised, and the vast majority of the world sympathised. And it was only people like David Cameron and the young Conservatives with their Hang Mandela badges who were on the wrong side on that question. So let's have no lessons from David Cameron about who's a sympathiser. He was a sympathiser of the hangman of apartheid. He was a sympathiser with that vile racist system. And we are with Corbyn when he says that we have to be against the wars, against the Israeli state, in support of the Palestinians, and in support of those who are facing the wrath of imperialist war at the moment. And finally, he said, I want Generation Rent to become Generation Buy, which is a tremendous scheme, apparently, to deal with the fact that there's a massive housing crisis in Britain. And they're going to remove the necessity on developments for people to build houses for rent, and instead they're going to be allowed to build houses for sale. And they're going to be very cheap houses, very cheap. So in somewhere like Manchester, they will cost as little as £250,000. As little as that, as little as that. Where I live in Hackney in East London, they will cost as little as £450,000. Which, to be honest, means that the idea that this is going to be opening up to the vast majority of people is arrant nonsense. My kids are never going to be able to afford to live where I live. And for the vast majority of people, the only way for them to get a decent house would not be foolish schemes of this sort, but a mass programme of council house building, which would make it possible to have genuinely affordable housing. And that's what we need in Britain, not these ridiculous schemes that come out from the Tories. So we learnt that about what's coming, and actually, let's be clear, there's worse on the horizon. Because if you look at the most recent IMF, International Monetary Fund report, what it tells you is that they are now forecasting for the next 12 months the lowest rate of economic growth since the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008. In other words, things are not getting better, they are slowing down. The Chinese economy is slowing down, the Brazilian economy is in recession, the Indian economy is not expanding at the rate that it was, and so on. And therefore, they are likely to attack us even harder to try and regain the profitability that they have lost. And that will mean more cuts. Osborne said in his speech that there will be 20 billion of cuts in the spending announcement in November. But that's just a foretaste of what more is to come. And the problem is not just about economics and austerity, crucial though those questions are. It's also that the world is driven again and again towards the brink of war. It's a frightening prospect of what's happening in Syria at the moment. Of course, the suffering of the Syrian people has gone on for many years. The 4 million of them driven from the country, a further 7 million internally displaced, 300,000 dead due to the wars in Syria. But we're also seeing now a sharp clash of imperialisms. The reason I grabbed my phone just before I speak was to quote from the Financial Times. Gideon Rachman, the chief foreign affairs columnist for the Financial Times, says this. He compared with what's happening in Syria now to Spain in the 1930s. A similar proxy war is underway in Syria today, with both the Russian and US air forces bombing targets and foreign fighters pouring in. The countries that backed opposite sides in Spain in the 1930s were fighting each other directly by the 40s. The risk of the Syrian conflict leading to a direct clash between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or even the Russians and the Americans, cannot be discounted. Now, let's hope Rachman is wrong, but the threat is real. Here we are seeing how a conflict in the Middle East could become a much more generalised conflict. This is what capitalism offers us at 2015. Poverty for very many hundreds of millions of people across the globe. War, whether it be the wars that are launched by the imperialist powers or those that they generate, and the threat of climate chaos, which we know hangs over the whole of humanity, but that's not enough to make the ruling class do anything sufficient to deal with it. That for them they will drive the whole of society over the edge of the cliff rather than rein back from what's necessary in order to make a profit. This is the serious challenge we face us. I'm not trying to depress you, but if it were just that, it would be a depressing picture. But we learned something else from Manchester as well. We learned that there is real resistance taking place and a new confidence in Britain about the readiness to fight back, of which Candy Strike is one example, actually. But it was fantastic we had 100,000 on the streets on Sunday. It was brilliant that we had 250,000 in London on the 20th of June. It was fantastic that on the same day that Jeremy Corbyn was announced as leader, 100,000 people marched in support of refugees. What had been the toughest, most difficult, hardest argument in British politics suddenly transformed partly by the recognition of the suffering of people fleeing Syria and elsewhere, but also by the resilience and the fight back of refugees themselves, who refused to die in silence, but instead fought back and marched and campaigned and made the world listen to them, and on that basis have generated a movement of solidarity. And it was fantastic that, as well as the big march, we had the smaller mobilisations in Manchester around the People's Assembly, the Stand Up to Racism demonstration and meeting, the demonstration in support of the health service, the fantastic Disabled Peoples Against the Cuts, DPAC mobilisation, the mobilisation against climate change and fracking, and so on. And the biggest one, of course, was the meeting that Jeremy Corbyn did, the People's Post meeting. All the other speakers didn't really speak about the post office. It was typical of Jeremy that, having been told he was come to do a meeting about the post office, he did indeed speak about the post office. It's part of Jeremy's eternal charm that he doesn't feel the need to grandstand about such things. What was great about it, 1,000 people inside, and Charlotte said 7,000 outside, and a feeling of confidence, of anger, quite rightly. People hate the Tories. I mean, you know, it's not the way to change society and so on, but I quite like it when someone threw an egg at one of them, to be quite honest. I'm glad that there is that feeling of bitter anger about the way the Tories are ripping up society. But it's not just about the anger. It's also about a new confidence. And Jeremy Corbyn exemplifies that. The fact that he won, the fact that a movement is trying to create itself around him, is of the greatest importance. It demonstrates that the mood that produced Syriza in Greece, Podemos in the Spanish state, that's fueling Bernie Sanders in the United States, that is lifting up the economic freedom fighters in South Africa, that saw the SNP win because it spoke to the left of Labour in Scotland. The same mood exists here. The same mood exists, and Jeremy Corbyn has demonstrated that. And it's been a massive lift for all of us who want to see an end to austerity and racism and a better society and to fight for socialism. And therefore, we have to think. We have to think about how we react to it. All of us on the left have to do that. And here's a few things that I think are important. Firstly, all of us have to support Jeremy Corbyn against the right. All of us, whether we're in the Labour Party or outside the Labour Party. If you don't know, we're not in the Labour Party. But nonetheless, we're supporting Jeremy Corbyn against the inevitable assault that will continue to come. Firstly from the Tories, we know that. From 90% of the media, will attack him every day as well, but also from the people inside his own party. Indeed, the majority, of course, of Labour MPs, disgruntled, resentful, truculent, would like to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn if they had a chance, but they've been told by people like Peter Mandelson, don't do it yet. You can't do it yet. We have to wait and hope that he doesn't do well in the elections, and then we can maybe do something about it. And the trade union leaders, not all of them, but many of them are in the same place. We know that Unite, biggest union, didn't want John McDonnell to be the Shadow Chancellor, for example. We know that Sir Paul Kenny of the GMB is just waiting for Corbyn to fall. So we're with Jeremy against those attacks that will come from the Tories, from the media, and from the Labour right and the trade union leaders as well. And it's absolutely necessary that we learn the lesson of why he won. He won not fundamentally because of organisation inside the Labour Party. I'm sure that was important in terms of the specificity of the vote and so on. He won fundamentally because there was a movement across the whole of society. He was lifted up by the People's Assembly demonstration on the 20th of June. He was lifted up by struggles like the National Gallery. He was helped by the fact that there was a deep and abiding current running through society that people were not going to have this for another 5 years. We saw it immediately after the election in those wonderful demonstrations called, many of them by young people, many of them by young women, immediately after the election that put thousands of people on the streets. People are not going to have it. And Jeremy Corbyn was lifted up that. We need to build a movement. We need to build a movement that says, Jeremy Corbyn is right. We need to get rid of Trident nuclear missiles. Majority of Labour MPs don't agree with that, but we do, and therefore all of us in or outside the Labour Party have to unite around that. There's a CND demonstration on the 20th of February next year, but we need to raise this argument broadly across the working class. There hasn't been an argument like this about nuclear weapons for a long time. I take it as a greatly reassuring fact that Corbyn said he wouldn't push the button. This is regarded, oh, how terrible. What an awful thing, he wouldn't destroy the world. I think we should be worried about this and say, I would push the button. I would destroy the world. Jeremy Corbyn is right, we need to get rid of the anti-union laws. Lots of Labour MPs are a bit ambivalent, they're not that they're in favour of the anti-union laws, but actually doing anything about it is what they're ambivalent about. We need to create a big movement against the anti-union laws, and if, as is very likely, regrettably, the Tories have enough in Parliament to pass the anti-union laws in November, we need to defy the anti-union laws. We need strikes, we need demonstrations, we need to learn the lessons from the past that the way you defy the anti-union laws is to strike, is to be prepared to use the power of organised workers, whether it's legal or not. Whether or not it breaks the law, we have to be prepared to defy. And the first group of workers who are hit by the anti-union laws, everybody needs to get out in their support. Everybody, whether it's a small group of workers or whether it's a whole union, everybody needs to make sure that we're fighting back against them. And Jeremy Corbyn can play a role in creating that sort of atmosphere. Jeremy Corbyn, brilliant that immediately after he was elected, on the same day, within the hour, he was coming out to support the Refugees Welcome demonstration. Jeremy Corbyn, we are with you around that question. Let's work together in support of refugees, against racism, against Islamophobia, against the Prevent legislation, in order to raise the level of resistance. And that unity is fantastically important, and then we need to have a political discussion. How are we going to change society? Because I hope Jeremy Corbyn does prosper. But firstly, we can't wait until the next general election. The only bit I disagreed with Jeremy Corbyn when he spoke on, when was it, Monday? Yes, I think it was Monday, wasn't it? Was when he said, it's probably going to be 2020 before we can get rid of the Tories. I don't accept that. I don't accept it because we can't wait that long, because think of the damage they will have caused by 2020. We have to try and create a movement which is capable of getting rid of them before 2020. We can't wait for it. And then we have to look at the experience of when people like Jeremy Corbyn get elected. And here the experience of Greece is important. Syriza was elected in January in Greece amongst a quite correct tide of celebration across the whole of Europe and in many other parts of the world, because an anti-austerity party had been elected. Someone who was going to stand up to the bankers and the bosses and the oligarchs and the European Union and tell them that the archbishops of austerity cannot be allowed to decree any longer the poverty of the Greek people. It was a fantastic moment. And then in July, the Greek people rejected in the Ochi referendum the austerity plans that had been presented by the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. And then, within a week, Syriza had collapsed. Syriza had collapsed and is now, regrettably, implementing a worse austerity programme than that which was implemented by their Tory predecessors. Why? Was Tsipras corrupt? No. Is Syriza a uniquely useless political formation? No. Many people are a product of a generation of resistance and fight back. And Syriza came to office because of 32 general strikes from the student movement, the occupation of Syntagma Square and so on. No, that's not the reason. The reason is power doesn't lie in Parliament. Power lies in the unelected bureaucracies, the people who control the real economic power, the offices, the factories, the mines, the call centres, and the great bureaucracies of the state which aren't open to genuine democratic control. And what we have to say is, why would Corbyn be different? Now, some people say to that, because he won't go as far as Syriza. This is an argument, again, I reject. There are people in the Labour Party who say, Jeremy must be very careful. He must withdraw from his more radical policies. He must stop talking about Trident. He must stop talking about getting rid of British support for NATO. He mustn't talk about high taxation on the rich. That will be disastrous. It will be disastrous if he pulls back from that programme. He was elected through radicalisation. He must continue to build radicalisation. But if he tries to do that, the state will attack him. I mean, we can see it already. They attack him over tiny things. Will you wear a red poppy? Will you bow down to the Queen? Glad to see you didn't bow down to the Queen today, by the way. Will you push the button? Will you recognise the importance of the national anthem? And so on and so on, and it goes on. But it will get much worse than that. You know, when that general was revealed to be saying that if Corbyn gets elected there will be a mutiny, it wasn't just words. This is how these people operate. This is what they think about. They think about that if anyone oversteps the mark, we are actually going to get rid of them. By democratic means, or if necessary, undemocratic means. That's the lesson of Greece. The people of Greece voted against austerity. The bankers and the bosses said, that's very interesting, but you have no right to make those decisions. We make those decisions. So stuff your votes, you're going to still get it. And that's what's happening in Greece at the moment. And some people say, well, Greece is a special case. But look in France. François Hollande was elected, great rejoicing at the end of a Tory government, and within months, Hollande was implementing the same programme as his predecessor, Nicolas Sarkozy, except worse in some respects. Worse in some respects. Why? Because power doesn't lie in Parliament, and therefore people compromise and adapt to the situation in which they find themselves. And this is the experience of Labour government after Labour government. That people elected on a tidal wave of expectation and hope find themselves implementing the decisions of the capitalist rulers of society. That's not something to despair about. It is to say we cannot achieve the sorts of transformation we want simply on the basis of working through Parliament. We need an independent movement outside Parliament, and we need something different to the Labour Party, a party which is concentrated fundamentally on achieving change through parliamentary mechanisms. And therefore, we need to both build the biggest possible united movement and at the same time create a political force which looks to revolutionary change, which looks to the possibility when a crisis comes like that in Greece to say the only way out for Syriza would have been to be more radical, not less radical, to take over the banks under workers' control, to take over the biggest industries, to begin to challenge the way in which the financiers move their funds across the globe, to have a revolutionary alternative to the crisis of capitalism. And we need also, finally, a vision, which is to say our vision is not simply what we have at the moment with a higher minimum wage or a little bit more council house building. We need to tear up the sort of society in which we live, which privileges a tiny elite, both within Britain and on a global scale, and to say that we need a world where people come before profit. A world where we tear out the roots of women's oppression and homophobia and racism, and a society of genuine equality where people can live in a democratic way, marrying together the needs of society and the immense resources of society, which opens up the possibility of everyone's life to be lived to the full. A life where we obviously and democratically decide how to deal with issues like climate chaos and put the needs of people and humanity as a whole before those of a tiny group of people dedicated solely to making profit. That requires a big movement, and it requires political organisation. That's what the Socialist Workers' Party is about.